Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The morning of December 28, 2024, arrived in Brandon, Mississippi, with the gentle stillness that characterizes quiet suburban life in the days following Christmas. The sun rose over modest houses adorned with fading holiday decorations, illuminating streets where families were settling into the comfortable rhythm of a Saturday morning between celebrations. In one home on a peaceful residential street, 2 vehicles sat parked in the driveway beside the garage, suggesting the occupants were inside, perhaps sleeping late or enjoying a lazy breakfast. But behind those locked doors and curtained windows, a tragedy had already unfolded that would shatter the carefully constructed image of a perfect divorce and expose the deadly consequences of control lost. Jennifer Sheffield had been born on September 9, 1994, arriving into a world full of possibility. By the time she reached 30 years old, she had accomplished more than many people achieve in a lifetime. Her dedication to science and medicine had defined her professional path from the beginning, guiding her through rigorous academic programs that demanded both intellectual brilliance and unwavering commitment. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry, immersing herself in the complex world of molecular structures and chemical reactions that govern life itself. But Jennifer was not content to stop there. She pursued and completed a Master of Medical Science in biology, pushing herself further into the frontiers of medical knowledge. Those who knew her during her academic years described her as exceptionally skilled, a student who approached learning with genuine enthusiasm rather than mere obligation. The Dean of Mississippi College, where she completed her graduate studies, remembered her as someone special, a young woman whose intellect matched her dedication. Jennifer applied her extensive education in the most demanding environment imaginable, the emergency room at Mississippi Medical Center. Emergency medicine requires a particular kind of person, someone who can make life and death decisions in seconds, who can maintain composure when chaos erupts around them, who can offer compassion to frightened patients while simultaneously calculating treatment protocols. Jennifer excelled in this high-pressure world. Her hospital co-workers looked forward to shifts with her, often commenting on her professionalism and the calm confidence she brought to even the most stressful situations. But her ambitions extended beyond nursing. Jennifer was preparing to take the next step in her career, studying to become a physician, ready to shoulder even greater responsibility in service of saving lives. Outside the hospital walls, Jennifer cultivated a life that appeared warm and fulfilling. She maintained an active presence on social media, particularly TikTok, where she shared glimpses of her interests with followers who came to know her through videos about gardening and cooking. Her posts showed a woman who found joy in nurturing plants and preparing meals, who took pride in creating a comfortable home. Friends and family spoke of her as a bright soul, someone whose presence lifted the spirits of everyone around her. Faith played a significant role in Jennifer's life, providing her with spiritual grounding and a sense of purpose beyond her professional accomplishments. Those close to her described her strong love for God, a devotion that shaped her worldview and guided her decisions. To anyone observing from the outside, Jennifer Sheffield seemed to have constructed a beautiful life, meaningful work, loving relationships, spiritual fulfillment, and dreams that stretched endlessly toward the future. Living in the Brandon home with Jennifer was her husband, Brandon Sheffield, a man 10 years her senior who presented a very different persona to the world. Born on September 22, 1984, in Mobile, Alabama, Brandon represented the archetype of a fun-loving Southern man with traditional interests. He enjoyed working on cars, the tactile satisfaction of mechanical problems, solved with skilled hands and the right tools. He spent time fishing, finding peace in the patient waiting that the sport demands. He played disc golf, combining athletic activity with social connection. People who encountered Brandon in social settings described him in overwhelmingly positive terms. He was the type of person who could light up a room simply by entering it, someone who seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of jokes and stories designed to create laughter and forge positive memories. But more than any hobby or social skill, Brandon defined himself through his role as a father. He had 2 daughters from relationships that predated his marriage to Jennifer, Gracie from a previous marriage, and later Kylie, whom he and Jennifer had welcomed together. According to his family members, Brandon was a devoted father who cherished his children above everything else. Spending time with Gracie and Kylie brought him genuine happiness, the kind of joy that cannot be manufactured or faked. This image of the devoted family man was reinforced by Jennifer's own friends, including one particularly close friend who had known the couple since the earliest days of their relationship. This friend watched their connection develop over years, consistently speaking positively about Brandon. She described him as a great person, someone she respected for the way he treated Jennifer. According to this friend, there were never any warning signs, no indications of aggression, no cause for concern. Within their social circle, Brandon was known as the fun-loving partner, supportive and kind, exactly the type of husband any woman would be fortunate to have. The Sheffield family story had begun nearly a decade before it ended in tragedy, when Jennifer and Brandon met in the mid-2010s. Their relationship was unconventional from the start. Jennifer was still a young woman focused on her education, barely out of her teenage years, while Brandon was already well into adulthood with an established life. The 10-year age gap created a dynamic that initially felt stabilizing. Brandon seemed mature, dependable, someone who could provide guidance and security. More significantly, Brandon already had a daughter, Gracie, from his previous marriage. From the beginning, Jennifer understood what she was entering into. She knew Brandon came with responsibilities, that being with him meant accepting a ready-made family structure. Rather than being deterred, Jennifer embraced this reality. She formed a connection with Gracie, and over time, the two developed a close and trusting bond. When Jennifer and Brandon welcomed their daughter Kylie together, Jennifer found herself fully immersed in family life. Between the ages of 20 and 30, she devoted herself entirely to being a wife and mother, while simultaneously pursuing one of the most demanding careers imaginable in the medical field. Friends and neighbors viewed the Sheffields as a solid family unit, raising their daughters in a home filled with love and stability. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family portrait, fractures had been forming for years, invisible to outsiders, but increasingly impossible for Jennifer to ignore. The first visible crack in the facade did not emerge through rumors or police involvement. It came directly from Jennifer herself, broadcast to thousands of followers on social media. Among her usual TikTok videos about gardening and cooking, one particular video stood distinctly apart. The upbeat tone that characterized her other content was gone, replaced by something subdued and deeply vulnerable. Jennifer reached out to her followers not with another domestic tip or cheerful life update, but with a profound spiritual plea. She asked her audience a direct and deeply personal question: what do you do when it feels as though God is silent? She explained that she was accustomed to feeling guidance from a higher power, but at that moment, all she felt was silence. In her monologue, she spoke about a life path that once appeared to be the only way forward, yet continued placing barriers in her way, obstacles growing heavier and more difficult with each step. On camera, Jennifer openly acknowledged that she had recently reached a realization. Her own plans no longer seemed to matter. In her search for meaning, she referenced a familiar saying, "The teacher is always silent during the test." That moment reflected a harsh reality. A woman perceived by others as a successful professional and joyful mother was now turning to strangers online in search of answers. The cause of the marital breakdown was not a dramatic scandal, not infidelity or a sudden confrontation. It was a slow erosion that had been happening over many years. Friends Jennifer confided in observed the same pattern repeatedly. She was worn down. When they first began their relationship, the 10-year age difference felt like a source of stability, something that made Brandon seem dependable and mature. But a decade later, the dynamic had reversed completely. Jennifer, holding 2 degrees and working in intensive care, had become the driving force of the household. She was constantly studying, pushing herself ahead, setting new objectives, planning to become a doctor. Brandon, according to those close to them, remained the same person, kind, fun, and likable, but stuck in place. The tension stemmed not from cruelty or neglect, but from ambition and personal growth. Jennifer had outgrown the marriage. What felt comfortable to her at 20, being a warm and supportive wife beside a fun-loving husband, felt limiting and suffocating by the time she reached 30. She was carrying the emotional and daily responsibilities, raising her daughters and pushing herself to exhaustion, while Brandon stayed firmly within his comfort zone. In private discussions, Jennifer admitted that she felt alone even while married. She wanted a partner who would grow alongside her, not someone who required constant emotional upkeep. For her, the choice to divorce was not about destruction. It was about letting go of weight and finally being able to breathe. In the fall of 2024, the private struggles of the Sheffields reached a stage where the truth could no longer be hidden. The couple decided to divorce. Although they continued to live under the same roof, their social standing changed in a way that was visible to everyone who followed them online. Jennifer and Brandon, nearly at the same time, updated their personal Facebook profiles. Under relationship status, both profiles now displayed single. This does not occur automatically. If one partner changes their status, the other does not update unless done intentionally. Each of them had to access their profile settings and manually confirm the separation. It was a public statement that the relationship had ended, a final boundary being set for friends and acquaintances to see. In today's world, a relationship status change on social media is often interpreted as an official announcement. Both spouses made that decision deliberately, defining the limits of a new reality while still living in the same house. On December 10, 2024, just 18 days before law enforcement would secure the Brandon home, Jennifer uploaded a detailed video message on TikTok. The recording was intended to clearly explain what was happening within the family and to put an end to speculation. On camera, she appeared calm and collected, and her tone contradicted every stereotype associated with painful separations. She described Brandon's behavior during the divorce process using a single word: incredible. According to Jennifer, the couple was maintaining complete civility for the sake of their daughters. She stressed that they were functioning as a team, working together to move through this period with as little damage as possible. She carefully outlined the exact conditions of their arrangement. Property and assets were to be divided evenly, 50-50, with no arguments, no courtroom disputes, no disagreements over physical belongings. She spoke with assurance about Brandon continuing to provide financial support for his daughters, something that relieved part of the responsibility she knew she would soon shoulder. The core of her message was not focused on the past, but on what lay ahead. Jennifer told her audience that she was getting ready to raise her children as a single mother and, for the first time in her life, depend entirely on her own earnings. She candidly talked about the financial obstacles in front of her: buying a new house, handling a mortgage, the necessity of careful budgeting. She asked viewers for tips on saving money and described the measures she had already put in place: eliminating coffee shop purchases, switching to caffeine pills, doing her own hair, taking care of manicures at home. The video created the image of a woman deliberately constructing a new way of life. She discussed everyday specifics, interest rates, and strategies to save money, demonstrating full preparedness for living independently. Her plans included relocating and establishing a home of her own, signaling long-term intention. The video captured a moment when Jennifer Sheffield believed the hardest part of the divorce was already behind her, and that ahead was a challenging but safe path toward independence. But investigators and experts who study domestic violence hear something very different beneath statements like these. The December 10th video, which remains available online, shows Jennifer appearing composed, speaking about future plans and referring to her husband as an incredible person. Yet exactly 18 days passed between the release of that video and the moment law enforcement arrived at the home in Brandon. Specialists identify this span as the period of greatest risk. Jennifer's words about an amicable separation stand in stark contrast to how the story concluded. Investigative research shows that when a woman publicly compliments her partner during a breakup, it is often defensive behavior. Behavioral psychology explains this as a method of smoothing the edges, of maintaining the image of the family, and more importantly, of avoiding triggering aggression from a man she is still living with under the same roof. Jennifer Sheffield and Brandon Sheffield, despite updating their Facebook statuses to single, continued to live in the same house. The phase when someone is actively preparing to leave is considered the most dangerous point in a relationship. According to justice system data, the likelihood of a fatal outcome for a woman rises sharply when she makes it clear she is leaving permanently. Brandon's sense of control began to erode. His familiar routine, his image as the life of the party, and his stable domestic life started to fall apart. Jennifer, openly planning to buy her own home and budgeting as a single mother, was making one thing unmistakable. Through her actions, there would be no reversal. Behind the closed doors of that Mississippi home, a quiet escalation took place. The exact words spoken during those 2.5 weeks remain unknown. There were no cameras inside the house, but the facts tell the story. The ideal divorced Jennifer, described to thousands of followers, existed only online. In reality, the tension continued to intensify. Brandon watched as his wife became more distant, more self-reliant, moved ahead with documents and plans. The carefully curated image shown to friends on social media no longer aligned with what was happening inside the home. Commenters applauded the couple for their maturity and judgment, accepting the narrative of a calm, respectful separation. But inside the house, that storyline was not unfolding. The control Brandon once exercised over the family was gone. 18 days of silence ended not with Jennifer settling into a new home, but with relatives making phone calls that were never answered. On the morning of December 28, 2024, family members arrived at the Sheffield residence as planned. Vehicles pulled into the driveway beside the garage, and people got out smiling, anticipating the familiar comfort of a family gathering. They approached the front door and knocked. Silence. Another knock followed, louder than before. Still nothing. Jennifer's and Brandon's cars were visible outside, a clear indication that they were home. Relatives began dialing their cell phones. From behind locked doors and windows, the sound of ringing phones echoed through vacant rooms. Call after call, ring after ring. No one rejected the calls, but no one answered. What had been mild concern on the porch shifted into fear. Someone looked through the windows, searching for any movement. Another person tugged at the door handle, hoping it might be open. Instead, the house was locked from within, concealing its horrifying truth. After enough time passed, and it became obvious there was no reasonable explanation for the silence, a shaking hand called emergency services. Officers with the Brandon Police Department answered the call. They examined the outside of the house. Windows were undamaged, doors were secured, and there were no visible signs of forced entry or unauthorized access. With no clear indication of how the couple could have left the residence and no response from inside, police made the choice to enter the home. Inside, the responding patrol officers were met by silence. As they moved through the rooms, they discovered the bodies of 30-year-old Jennifer and 40-year-old Brandon. Both were pronounced dead. An initial assessment of the scene revealed clear signs of a violent event. Detectives who arrived after forcing entry quickly ruled out robbery or an external assault. The locks were secure. There were no indications of forced entry through the windows. Forensic experts documented what is known as a closed-scene crime. Only 2 people were inside the residence. According to the official coroner's report and ballistic evidence, the events followed a murder-suicide scenario. Brandon Sheffield was identified as the sole aggressor. Jennifer Sheffield had no realistic chance to defend herself or escape. The reconstruction showed that the fatal incident involving Jennifer occurred while she was inside the home. Investigators determined a clear sequence of gunshots. The firearm was in Brandon's possession, and the initial shots were fired at Jennifer. Experts concluded that the injuries were not survivable. After the act was carried out, Brandon Sheffield turned the gun on himself, ending the incident through self-inflicted harm. Law enforcement discovered his body near Jennifer's. The positioning of shell casings and the pattern of gunshot residue confirmed that no third party played a role in this tragedy. Detectives connected this eruption of violence to a loss of control indirectly reflected in the divorce filings. The legal process Jennifer initiated involved dividing property and arranging custody, but Brandon's physical actions brought that process to an irreversible conclusion. The entire image of a perfect divorce, carefully displayed on social media, collapsed in the reality of a single morning. Brandon, who was steadily losing his hold over Jennifer's life with each document that was signed, reclaimed absolute dominance in the only manner still available to him, through violent actions. What came next, after authorities officially closed the investigation, redirected public focus away from forensic details and toward moral questions. Once all mandated procedures at the medical examiner's office were finished, the remains of Jennifer and Brandon were released to their respective families for burial. The family chose not to keep the farewell services separate. Instead, a single memorial honoring both spouses was planned for the same date and held at the same venue. Organizers selected a nearby funeral home where tribute displays were set up within a shared space. This choice to conduct a combined farewell for a woman who was killed and the man responsible for her death became known to the public through photographs and witness descriptions. Upon entering the room, those in attendance encountered two memorial tables. The difference between them was immediately noticeable. Brandon's memorial was large in scale. His table was covered with portraits, fishing pictures, photos with friends, and sports-related items. The display suggested an energetic, popular man whose life seemed busy and full. Only a short distance away stood Jennifer's table, which contained an urn and just a limited selection of photographs. In comparison to her husband's presentation, Jennifer's memorial appeared noticeably simple and minimal. Visually, it gave the impression that Brandon was the primary focus of the service, while Jennifer occupied a lesser position. When these images appeared online, reactions from those following the case were swift. The main criticism centered on the ethical imbalance. Commenters highlighted the contradiction of honoring in almost the same place, and at the same time both a woman whose life was taken and the man who fired the fatal shot. Another surge of criticism focused specifically on the memorial tables. The stark simplicity of Jennifer's display, contrasted with the abundance of images celebrating Brandon, was widely viewed as a sign of disrespect toward the victim by those who organized the service. Observers wrote that the family seemed to be grieving a fun-loving man and devoted father, while ignoring the reality that his actions resulted in 2 deaths. Online communities accused relatives of attempting to soften Brandon's image and remove the context of domestic violence, even during an event meant for remembrance. The official investigation in Brandon, Mississippi, has since been closed. Authorities sealed the case after the death of the sole suspect. From a legal perspective, the story ended the moment the coroner documented the time of death. But for Gracie and Kylie, Brandon's daughters, the impact of that night became a lasting and irreversible reality. The girls, whom Jennifer had treated as her own children, were left without parents and are now being cared for by relatives. In the public realm, only one digital remnant of the story remains. The video dated December 10th, the clip in which Jennifer smiles, discusses plans to purchase a home, and refers to the man who would later commit the crime as an incredible person. That footage is no longer viewed as a lifestyle vlog, but as recorded evidence of a fatal error in judgment. The Sheffield family case became a stark reminder of how misleading social media appearances can be. Thousands of viewers watched what seemed to be a perfect divorce play out in real time, unaware they were observing a sequence of events moving steadily toward a deadly conclusion. The change of relationship status to single on Facebook, which audiences interpreted as a routine update, became in reality the catalyst for Brandon's final act of control. Jennifer Sheffield, a woman who dedicated her life to saving others in emergency rooms, who earned advanced degrees through sheer determination, who dreamed of becoming a physician and raising her daughters with love and opportunity, lost her life in the most preventable of tragedies, at the hands of someone she once trusted, someone she had built a life with, someone who chose violence when faced with the reality that she was choosing herself. Story 2. The Florida sun danced across the turquoise waters of the Atlantic, painting the horizon in shades of amber and gold as evening approached on May 14, 2017. Isabella Hellman stood aboard the 37-foot catamaran named Surf into Summer, the gentle Caribbean breeze lifting strands of her dark hair as the vessel cut through the waves. At 41 years old, she was finally on the delayed honeymoon she had long anticipated, sailing from Cuba toward the Florida Keys with her husband of just 3 months, Louis Bennett. The rhythmic sound of water against the hull should have been peaceful, romantic even, but beneath the surface of this idyllic scene lurked tensions that neither the ocean's vastness nor the promise of adventure could dissolve. Isabella's journey to this moment had been one of hope and reinvention. Born in Cuba, she had emigrated to the United States and built a life for herself in Delray Beach, Florida, where she worked as a real estate agent. She was a woman who believed in second chances, in the possibility of love finding you when you least expected it. Her relationship with Louis Bennett had begun as an online fling, a digital connection that blossomed across continents and time zones. Louis, a dual British and Australian citizen who worked as a sailor, spent most of his time traversing the world's oceans, rarely setting foot in Florida. Their courtship had been unconventional. Isabella was always the one traveling to meet him, flying to ports in Southampton, Tahiti, Singapore, wherever his work took him. She had even flown to England to meet his parents, trying to weave herself into the fabric of his peripatetic existence. By early 2017, their whirlwind romance had produced both a marriage and a daughter. Little Amelia had arrived in the world, a tiny bundle of promise and complexity, and in February of that year, during a getaway to Atlanta, Georgia, Isabella and Louis had married. The couple had purchased a condominium in the Pine Ridge development of Delray Beach for $123,000, attempting to establish roots, to create something stable. But stability proved elusive. Friends and family members who knew Isabella well began to notice troubling signs in the relationship, shadows that lengthened as the months progressed. The marriage, observers noted, seemed fraught with discord from the beginning. Isabella and Louis disagreed on nearly everything concerning their daughter's upbringing. What Amelia should eat, what diapers she should wear, even whether she should wear a Baltic amber teething necklace. Louis was insistent that Isabella move with him to Australia, abandoning her life, her work, and her family in Florida, but she refused. The financial pressures mounting on the young family only intensified the strain. Despite their inability to pay bills, Louis had flown to Thailand just 3 months after Amelia's birth to attend a boxing academy, leaving Isabella alone with their infant daughter. Those close to Isabella reported that she and Louis slept in separate rooms, and that he was often controlling and angry when home, allegedly demeaning her at every opportunity. Text messages Isabella sent to Louis in the months before her disappearance painted a portrait of a woman growing increasingly afraid. On October 14, 2016, she had written to him expressing concerns about his behavior, messages that would later be scrutinized by investigators trying to piece together what had really happened aboard the Surf into Summer. Isabella confided in friends that perhaps Amelia had been born at the wrong time, that she and Louis simply did not get along when it came to their daughter. Louis had been pressuring Isabella to cut short her maternity leave and return to work, while she yearned to stay home and care for her baby. Isabella's family would later describe the unbearable pain of watching someone they loved trapped in a deteriorating marriage, sensing danger but unable to intervene in time. Yet despite the mounting evidence of marital strife, the couple embarked on their delayed honeymoon in late April 2017. Isabella flew to St. Martin on April 29th, where she met Louis. The plan was ambitious. They would sail from St. Martin to Puerto Rico, then to Cuba, and finally return to Key West, Florida. It was meant to be a romantic journey, an opportunity to reconnect away from the pressures of new parenthood and financial stress. They had taken similar trips before Amelia was born, but never just the two of them alone. Isabella's sister, Diana, spoke with her by phone on Sunday night, May 14th, at 8:25 p.m. Isabella explained that it had been difficult to connect the phone service, as Louis's friend had warned her it would be hard in the middle of the ocean. She told Diana they had just left Cuba and were sailing across the open water. Her last words to her sister were simple and full of anticipation. "I'll see you tomorrow." She would never make it home. In the early morning hours of May 15th, 2017, approximately 30 miles west of Cay Sal in the Bahamas, United States Coast Guard received a distress call. Louis Bennett reported that his catamaran had struck something and was taking on water. According to the account he would give to Coast Guard rescuers, he had gone to sleep below deck shortly after 8 o'clock in the evening, leaving Isabella on deck wearing a life jacket. He claimed he awoke in the middle of the night to find the vessel flooding and his wife gone. The Surf Into Summer, a 1986 Fountain Paget, Louisiana 37 sailing catamaran, was sinking. Bennett had managed to deploy a life raft and abandon ship, taking with him only a single backpack of personal belongings. A Coast Guard helicopter arrived at the scene, and a rescue swimmer descended to retrieve the lone survivor from his life raft. The rescue swimmer would later note something peculiar. Bennett's backpack was unusually heavy for someone fleeing a sinking vessel in the middle of the night. Louis Bennett was flown to the Florida Keys, wet and shaken but alive. Behind him, the Surf Into Summer slipped beneath the waves, and somewhere in that vast expanse of Caribbean water, Isabella Hellman had vanished without a trace. For 4 agonizing days, the Coast Guard conducted an extensive search of the waters where Isabella had disappeared. Helicopters crisscrossed the search grid, boats scoured the area, eyes strained against the glittering surface of the ocean looking for any sign of her. A piece of clothing, the life jacket Bennett claimed she had been wearing, anything. But the sea kept its secrets. No body was ever found. No debris that could definitively tell them what had happened to Isabella Hellman emerged from the depths. From the very beginning, something about Louis Bennett's story troubled investigators. Coast Guard officials who interviewed him noted inconsistencies in his account, details that didn't align with the physical evidence or with the experience one would expect from a sailor of Bennett's caliber. Louis Bennett was no novice on the water. He had extensive sailing experience, including training in emergency procedures, and had previously sailed from St. Martin all the way to Australia. Isabella, by contrast, was a naturalized U.S. citizen born in Cuba who had not trained in emergency sailing procedures and had far less experience. If anyone should have survived a maritime emergency, logic suggested it would be the experienced sailor, not his less experienced wife. The Coast Guard investigation quickly transitioned from a rescue operation to something more suspicious, and soon the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the inquiry. When Bennett returned to his Delray Beach home, neighbors watched through their windows as men in powder blue latex gloves searched his car and questioned him. The FBI began examining the belongings Bennett had taken with him into the life raft, and what they discovered transformed the case entirely. Inside Bennett's unusually heavy backpack, investigators found something extraordinary: gold and silver coins, along with $22,000 in cash. The coins were no ordinary currency. Law enforcement traced them back to a vessel called the Kitty R, a ship Bennett had worked on in St. Martin in 2016. The coins had been reported as stolen from that vessel by Bennett himself, yet here they were, in his possession, carefully packed and taken aboard the life raft while his wife disappeared into the ocean. When the FBI initially found the coins, they returned them to Bennett at his Florida home a week later, not yet realizing the significance of what they had discovered. But on the same day the coins were returned, the FBI realized Bennett had been the one who reported them stolen. Agents rushed back to his residence to conduct a more thorough search, and hidden inside a pair of boat shoes, they found an additional 162 gold coins valued at $38,480. As investigators dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding the sinking of the surf into summer, more disturbing evidence emerged. Photographs of the wreckage revealed damage to the catamaran's hull that appeared to have been inflicted from inside the vessel. The holes showed signs that the boat had been intentionally scuttled, deliberately sunk rather than accidentally damaged by striking an object as Bennett had claimed. The evidence suggested that someone aboard that catamaran had wanted it to go down, and only one person had survived to tell the tale. While the investigation into Isabella's disappearance continued, Louis Bennett's actions in the aftermath raised further suspicions. Just days after Isabella vanished, Bennett traveled to Cuba, claiming he hoped his wife had somehow made it back to her native country. He told reporters he found no signs of her and was no longer holding out hope that she was alive. But his behavior toward Isabella's family told a different story. On the Sunday following the incident, Bennett returned to pick up baby Amelia from Isabella's family. 2 hours later, he came back with a Boca Raton police officer, demanding the baby's belongings. The family, devastated and suspicious, watched helplessly as he took their granddaughter. In the months that followed, Bennett made moves that seemed calculated to benefit from Isabella's disappearance. He attempted to have his wife declared legally dead so he could claim her estate. Meanwhile, Isabella's family, convinced that Bennett was responsible for her death, took desperate measures of their own. They bugged the couple's apartment in Delray Beach, recording conversations in hopes of capturing evidence of Bennett's involvement. The recordings revealed the depth of the marital problems between Isabella and Louis, the financial struggles, the disagreements over raising their daughter, the pressure surrounding a potential move to Australia. In August 2017, 3 months after Isabella's disappearance, federal prosecutors took action. Louis Bennett was indicted on charges of smuggling stolen gold and silver coins. He pleaded guilty to transporting stolen property and received a 7-month sentence. But this was only the beginning. While Bennett served his time for the smuggling conviction, investigators continued building their case around Isabella's death. In February 2018, nearly a year after Isabella vanished, the other shoe dropped. Federal prosecutors charged Louis Bennett with second-degree murder on the high seas. The indictment alleged that Bennett had deliberately scuttled the surf into summer and left his wife of 3 months to die so he could obtain her estate. The prosecution believed they could prove that Bennett, motivated by the couple's marital strife and financial gain, had committed the ultimate betrayal on the dark waters of the Caribbean. Yet proving murder without a body is one of the most difficult challenges in criminal law. The case against Bennett, while compelling, was almost entirely circumstantial. There were no witnesses to what happened aboard that catamaran on the night of May 14th and into the early hours of May 15th. There was no confession, no forensic evidence that definitively placed Bennett's hands around his wife's throat or showed him pushing her overboard. There was only the suspicious sinking, the stolen coins, the lies, and the pattern of a troubled marriage. As the case moved through the legal system, Bennett's defense team understood the weakness in the prosecution's position. In November 2018, faced with the very real possibility that a jury might acquit him despite the suspicious circumstances, federal prosecutors made a difficult decision. They offered Bennett a plea deal. If he would plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter on the high seas, a lesser charge carrying a maximum sentence of 8 years, they would drop the second-degree murder charge. As part of the agreement, Bennett would have to waive his right to appeal his sentence and renounce all claims to Isabella's estate. The money would go to Amelia, Isabella's daughter. Bennett accepted the deal. By doing so, He admitted that Isabella's death had occurred as a result of his knowledge of circumstances that could have reasonably enabled him to foresee a threat to her life, and that he had negligently failed to act to prevent her death. It was not an admission of murder, but it was an acknowledgement that he bore responsibility for what had happened to his wife. Isabella's family initially asked the judge to reject the plea agreement, wanting Bennett to face the full weight of a murder trial. But the legal realities were stark, and eventually, the path forward became clear. A judge officially declared Isabella Hellman dead in May 2019, clearing the way for Amelia to inherit her mother's estate. The ruling granted the toddler $18,000 as a family allowance. On May 28, 2019, Louis Bennett stood before U.S. District Judge Federico Moreno in Miami for sentencing. He apologized to Isabella's family, a statement that rang hollow to those who had spent 2 years watching him evade full accountability for their loved one's disappearance. Bennett's defense attorney asked for leniency, citing his lack of a criminal history. But federal prosecutor Kurt Lunkenheimer painted a different picture, telling the court, Louis Bennett was selfish and focused on himself. He did nothing to look for her, plus his actions afterward doubled and tripled the pain of Hellman's family. Judge Moreno sentenced Bennett to the maximum term of 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and deportation. Bennett was also ordered to pay $22,910, the amount of cash seized from his backpack, in restitution to Amelia. There is no parole in the federal system, meaning Bennett would be required to serve at least 85% of his sentence. He was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Oakdale, Louisiana, with a scheduled release date of January 20th, 2025. After the sentencing, Isabella's family spoke to reporters, expressing satisfaction with the outcome and announcing they had forgiven Bennett. They looked forward to visiting their granddaughter Amelia, who had been taken by Bennett to Scotland and left with his parents before he returned to Florida to face charges. Bennett's parents, who became Amelia's legal guardians, stated they would allow Isabella's family to visit the child. But the pain of those lost years, the time stolen from them by Bennett's actions and choices, could never be recovered. The waters off Cay Sal never gave up Isabella Hellman's body. Somewhere beneath those waves, in depths unknown, lies the truth of her final moments. Whether she fought for her life as water rushed into the catamaran, whether she called out for the husband who should have saved her, whether she had time to think of her baby daughter sleeping safely on shore. The ocean keeps these secrets, and Louis Bennett, the only person who could answer these questions with certainty, has chosen silence over full disclosure. What remains is the story of a woman who came to America seeking opportunity and built a life through determination and hope. A woman who believed in love enough to fly across continents to be with someone who never quite made space for her in his world. A woman who became a mother and wanted nothing more than to raise her daughter with love and attention. And a woman whose life was cut tragically short on what should have been a romantic voyage, leaving behind a little girl who will grow up knowing her mother only through photographs and the stories of those who loved her. The case of Isabella Hellman stands as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place for a person can be in close quarters with someone they trust, far from help, far from witnesses, where the vastness of the ocean can swallow evidence and transform murder into mystery. For Isabella's family, the sentencing brought a measure of justice, but no verdict could ever bring back the vibrant woman they lost or give Amelia the mother she deserved to know. In courtrooms and in the hearts of those who mourn her, Isabella Hellman's story endures, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to a life that mattered, a voice that will not be forgotten, and a mystery that the sea will hold forever. Story 3. The morning sun rose over the Mojave Desert on June 28, 2014, casting long shadows across the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center in 29 Palms, California. Inside a modest apartment on the base, 19-year-old Erin Corwin stirred awake earlier than usual. She moved quietly through the small space she shared with her husband, Jonathan Corwin, a young Marine corporal. The apartment still held traces of their Tennessee roots, photographs from their hometown of Oak Ridge, reminders of simpler days when they had been childhood sweethearts who met in the 5th grade. Erin gently woke John sometime between 6 and 7 in the morning, her voice soft with the excitement of the day ahead. She told him she planned to drive out to Joshua Tree National Park to scout hiking trails. Her mother, Lor Hevelin, was scheduled to visit the following week, and Erin wanted to find the perfect paths they could explore together during her stay. It seemed like a thoughtful gesture, the kind of thing that reflected Erin's caring nature. John, accustomed to his wife's independence and her love of the outdoors, thought nothing unusual of the plan. He kissed her goodbye, never imagining it would be the last time he would see his wife alive. Erin climbed into her car and drove away from the military base, heading toward the vast expanse of desert that stretched endlessly beyond 29 Palms. The landscape was unforgiving, a brutal terrain of sand, rock, and scattered vegetation baking under the relentless California sun. It was beautiful in its desolation, but it was also dangerous. Hundreds of abandoned mine shafts dotted the region, remnants of gold mining operations that had ceased decades earlier. These deep holes in the earth, some plunging more than 100 feet into darkness, were scattered across more than 300 rugged acres of desert. As the hours passed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, John expected his wife to return. But Erin did not come home. The afternoon faded into evening, and still there was no sign of her. A knot of worry began to form in John's stomach. He tried calling her cell phone, but there was no answer. He waited, hoping she had simply lost track of time or encountered car trouble. But as darkness fell over the desert and his wife remained missing, John's concern transformed into genuine fear. It was not until 24 hours had passed that John finally contacted authorities to report Erin missing. The delay would later strike some as suspicious, but investigators would come to understand that John had been hoping, praying even, that his wife would simply walk through the door with a reasonable explanation. When the Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents arrived to take his statement, John passed a polygraph test without difficulty. Digital evidence quickly confirmed that he had been on the base nearly the entire day his wife disappeared. John Corwin was not responsible for whatever had happened to his wife. But someone was. Special Agent Clifton Randolph Jr. of NCIS took charge of the investigation, and from the beginning, he knew they were facing a monumental challenge. The desert surrounding 29 Palms was enormous, a seemingly endless expanse of emptiness punctuated by more than 1,000 abandoned mine shafts. Finding one young woman in such terrain would be, as Deputy District Attorney Sean Doherty would later describe it, like finding a needle in 1,000 haystacks. The words barely captured the magnitude of the task. The desert was vast beyond comprehension, a whole lot of nothing that could swallow a person without a trace. Search and rescue teams mobilized immediately. Helicopters took to the skies, their rotors thundering over the desert as crews scanned the ground below for any sign of Erin or her vehicle. The San Bernardino Sheriff's Search and Rescue Team partnered with NCIS agents, forming a coordinated effort that would span weeks. Volunteers combed through the brutal landscape on foot, their faces burned by the sun, their bodies exhausted by the heat. News crews descended on 29 Palms, broadcasting updates about the missing Marine wife who had vanished without a trace. As investigators dug deeper into Erin's life, they began to uncover secrets that John Corwin never knew existed. Friends and neighbors came forward with information that painted a very different picture of Erin's final days. She had not been planning a simple scouting trip for her mother. She had been planning to meet someone. That someone was Christopher Brandon Lee, a 24-year-old Marine corporal who lived in the same apartment complex as Erin and John. Lee was married to a woman named Nicole, and the couple had a young daughter named Liberty. On the surface, the Lees and the Corwins appeared to be friendly neighbors, two young military families navigating life on a remote desert base. But beneath that veneer of normalcy lay a tangled web of deception and desire. Erin and Christopher had been having an affair. What had begun as friendship between neighbors had evolved into something far more complicated. They exchanged text messages filled with longing and secret meetings. Christopher had even written Aaron a love letter, a physical testament to feelings that should never have existed between two married people. The affair had been discovered by Christopher's wife, Nicole, who had found the incriminating text messages on her husband's phone. The discovery had sent shockwaves through both marriages, but the relationship between Aaron and Christopher had not ended. Instead, it had taken on a new dimension. Aaron had confided in a friend that she believed she was pregnant. The situation was complicated in the worst possible way. She did not know whether her husband John or her lover Christopher was the father. It was a secret that weighed heavily on Aaron, a burden that she carried alone in those final days. She had told Christopher about the pregnancy, and he had been forced to confront the reality that his affair might produce consequences that could not be hidden. On July 1st, 2014, 3 days after Aaron had last been seen, NCS agents brought Christopher Lee in for questioning. He arrived at the station cooperative and calm, declining the offer of an attorney. He admitted to having what he called an emotional affair with Aaron, but he maintained that on the day she disappeared, he had been alone in the desert near Joshua Tree, hunting coyotes. He claimed he had not seen Aaron that day, had no idea where she was, and was just as concerned about her disappearance as everyone else. But Christopher Lee was lying. As the investigation continued, detectives uncovered evidence that painted a very different picture. Witnesses came forward with information that contradicted Lee's story. A fellow Marine reported seeing a propane tank in Christopher's vehicle on the morning of June 28th. When asked about it, Christopher had allegedly told the Marine that he planned to blow up a mine shaft. Other neighbors recalled disturbing conversations they had had with Lee in the weeks before Aaron disappeared. He had talked about murder frequently, discussing various methods of killing and how one might dispose of a body. One neighbor, Connor Ising, testified that Christopher had specifically mentioned hiding a body in the desert and suggested that burning a body could eliminate evidence. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but Aaron herself remained lost in the vast desert. Days stretched into weeks, and the search continued with diminishing hope. The summer heat was unrelenting, and survival in such conditions without water and shelter was impossible. The search shifted from a rescue operation to a recovery mission, though no one wanted to say those words aloud to Aaron's family. Then, on August 16, 2014, nearly 2 months after Aaron had driven away from her home, searchers made a grim discovery at a remote location in the Dale Group mining district near Joshua Tree. At the bottom of an abandoned mine shaft known as the Rose of Peru mine, approximately 140 feet below the surface, they found human remains. The mine was located in an area so remote and difficult to access that it took nearly 2 hours of slow, bumpy, and dangerous travel to reach it. It was, as one local gold miner who knew the area described it, in the middle of nowhere, in no man's land. The body was that of Erin Corwin. Her remains were recovered from the dark shaft, and the nightmare that her family had been living became horrifyingly real. The autopsy would reveal the brutal truth of what had happened to the young woman. Erin had been strangled to death using a homemade garrote, a makeshift weapon constructed from 2 pieces of rebar and a cord. The garrote had been tightened around her neck for at least 5 minutes, cutting off her air supply until she died. She had then been pushed headfirst down the mine shaft, her body falling more than 100 feet into the darkness. The fall had caused additional injuries, fractures to her left collarbone and left rib that occurred at or near the time of death, and skull fractures that happened post-mortem, likely during the process of dragging or throwing her into the mine. Inside the mine shaft with Erin's body, investigators found other items that would prove crucial to the case. There was a propane tank, evidence of an apparent attempt to ignite a fire that might have destroyed the remains. There was a torch made from a shirt tied around a stick and a Sprite bottle. When forensic technicians tested these items for DNA, they found Christopher Lee's genetic material on the shirt that had been fashioned into a torch. The Sprite bottle, which still had its lid on, contained DNA from both Christopher and Erin. The scientific evidence was damning and undeniable. 2 days after Erin's body was discovered, Christopher Brandon Lee was arrested in Alaska. where he had fled with his family. He was charged with first-degree murder with a special circumstance of lying in wait, an enhancement that indicated premeditation and planning. Lee was extradited back to California to face trial for Aaron's murder. Initially, Christopher Lee pleaded not guilty to the charges. His defense team prepared to argue that he was innocent, that the evidence against him was circumstantial, that he had not been involved in Aaron's death. But as the prosecution built its case, the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. Investigators had uncovered internet search history from Christopher's computer showing queries about how to dispose of a body. They had testimony from multiple witnesses about his conversations regarding murder and body disposal. They had the physical evidence from the mine shaft linking him directly to the crime scene. And they had the fact that Christopher had borrowed a propane tank from a horse ranch shortly before Aaron's disappearance. When the trial began in October 2016, more than 2 years after Aaron's murder, the courtroom in San Bernardino was packed with family members, media, and observers eager to see justice served. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Sean Doherty, presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Christopher Lee's own suspicious behavior. They argued that Lee had meticulously planned Aaron's murder over several weeks after learning about her pregnancy. He had researched methods of killing and body disposal. He had scouted remote mine shafts in the desert. He had gathered the tools he would need: the garrote, the propane tank, the materials to start a fire. And then on June 28, 2014, he had lured Aaron out to the desert under false pretenses. She believed Christopher was taking her out to the desert for a surprise. She thought he might be planning to propose to her, that he might be ready to leave his wife and start a new life with Aaron and their unborn child. The cruel irony of this belief, that Aaron had driven to her death thinking she was heading toward a new beginning, was almost unbearable to contemplate. Then, in a shocking turn of events that stunned everyone in the courtroom, Christopher Lee took the witness stand in his own defense. It was an unusual move. Most defendants in murder trials do not testify, as it opens them up to cross-examination by the prosecution. But Lee and his defense attorney, David Koloyanides, had apparently decided that Christopher needed to tell his story directly to the jury. What followed was testimony that many observers found rehearsed, emotionless, and deeply disturbing. Lee admitted to having a sexual relationship with Aaron. He admitted that she had told him about the pregnancy and her uncertainty about paternity. He acknowledged writing the love letter to Aaron after his wife had discovered the affair. He admitted picking Aaron up at the location where her car was later found abandoned. But then his testimony took a bizarre turn. Christopher claimed that on the day Aaron disappeared, he had been planning to build a tire fire in a remote mine shaft, though he had not told Aaron about this plan. He testified that he told her he was taking her out for a surprise on what he described as a hunting trip. According to his account, he had thrown various items down the mine shaft: the propane tank, tires, water jugs filled with gasoline, and the makeshift torch, all in preparation for starting this mine fire. While he did this, he claimed, Aaron had simply sat in his Jeep listening to music. Then Lee testified, when he was unable to start the fire he had planned, he had become so upset that he decided to play Russian roulette with his gun while sitting in the vehicle. This had frightened Aaron, he said, and she had walked away into an adjacent mine shaft. When he was unable to follow through with shooting himself, he called Aaron back from the mine. It was at this point, according to Christopher's testimony, that Aaron made a shocking confession. She told him, he claimed, that she had molested his young daughter, Liberty. This accusation, leveled against a dead woman who could not defend herself, was met with outrage and disbelief by Aaron's family and many observers. Lee testified that upon hearing this alleged confession, a red-hot knife went through his heart and he lost control. As luck would have it, he said, he just happened to be holding the garrote in his hand at that moment, and in his rage, he strangled Aaron to death before dumping her body down the mine shaft. The testimony was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone. Lee appeared to try to cry at one point, making crying sounds, but no tears fell and no tissues were needed. To many watching, including the courtroom reporter who documented the trial, it sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. The defense was attempting to argue that Christopher had not planned to kill Erin, that her death had been an impulsive act committed in the heat of the moment rather than a premeditated murder. The prosecution tore this defense apart. Sean Doherty pointed out that Christopher had spent weeks researching murder and body disposal. He had gathered specific tools for killing. He had scouted remote locations. He had borrowed a propane tank and brought it to the scene. He had constructed a garrote specifically designed for strangulation. These were not the actions of someone acting impulsively. These were the calculated steps of someone planning a murder. Furthermore, the prosecution argued, Lee's claim about Erin confessing to child molestation was not only unsupported by any evidence, but it was contradicted by the actions of both Christopher and his wife Nicole. According to Lee's own earlier testimony, Nicole had supposedly seen suspicious irritation on their daughter's genitals and had immediately assumed Erin was responsible. Yet neither parent had called law enforcement or taken their daughter to a pediatrician. Even more damning, both parents had continued to allow Erin to babysit Liberty after these supposed suspicions arose. The story made no logical sense, and Doherty characterized it as yet another lie crafted by Christopher Lee to escape responsibility for his crime. The jury deliberated on the evidence, the testimony, and the character of the defendant. They considered the scientific evidence linking Lee to the crime scene. They weighed his constantly changing stories, first claiming he had not seen Erin that day, then admitting to killing her but claiming it was unplanned. They examined the timeline of his actions and the tools he had brought to the desert. And they thought about Erin Corwin, a 19-year-old woman who had made mistakes in her young life, but who had not deserved to die for them. On November 15, 2016, after just 15 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Christopher Brandon Lee was found guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of lying in wait. The swift verdict indicated that the jurors had seen through Lee's testimony and had recognized it for what it was, a desperate attempt to evade responsibility for a carefully planned and brutally executed murder. 2 weeks later, on November 29, 2016, Christopher Brandon Lee returned to court for sentencing. The courtroom was filled once again with Erin's family members, who had endured more than 2 years of grief and horror. They now had the opportunity to address the man who had taken their daughter, their sister, their loved one from them. Laura Hevelin, Erin's mother, stood before the court to deliver a victim impact statement. Her voice carried the weight of a mother's unbearable loss as she spoke directly to Christopher Lee. She expressed her inability to understand how anyone could think murder was an acceptable solution to their problems. With devastating simplicity, she pointed out that if Christopher had truly wanted to escape the situation with Erin, all he had to do was move to Alaska and change his phone number. Instead, he had chosen violence. He had chosen to end a young life and destroy countless others in the process. Christopher Lee was given an opportunity to address the court as well. He claimed that he had taken the stand to tell the truth, acknowledging that he had taken Erin's life in what he still characterized as an act of rage. But Sean Doherty, the prosecutor who had worked tirelessly to secure justice for Erin, called Lee's statement nonsense. In an interview, Doherty explained that this was what Christopher Lee did. He crafted lies around the facts of the case, constantly reshaping his story to fit whatever narrative might help him escape the consequences of his actions. The judge delivered the sentence that the jury's verdict had mandated. Christopher Brandon Lee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, never again walking free, never again able to hurt anyone else. For Erin's family, the sentence provided a measure of justice, though it could never restore what had been taken from them. The case of Erin Corwin is a tragedy that echoes far beyond the desert where she died. It is the story of a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, who made mistakes as all young people do, but who paid the ultimate price for trusting the wrong person. It is the story of a community torn apart by secrets and lies, of 2 young families destroyed by infidelity and violence. It is the story of the relentless efforts of law enforcement officers who refused to give up the search, even when the odds seemed impossible, and who worked for years to ensure that justice was served. The abandoned mine shafts of the Mojave Desert still stand, scattered across the vast landscape like dark wounds in the earth. The Rose of Peru mine, where Aaron's body was hidden for nearly 2 months, remains a silent testament to the terrible events that unfolded there on June 28, 2014. For those who knew and loved Erin Corwin, the desert will forever be haunted by her memory, a reminder of a bright young life extinguished far too soon, and of the evil that sometimes lurks behind the most ordinary faces. Story 4. In the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Bel Air, just southwest of Houston, Texas, where manicured lawns stretched before elegant homes and security was a given, Yvonne Stern lived what appeared to be a charmed life. She was a respected socialite, a devoted mother of 2, and the wife of Jeffrey Stern, a highly successful personal injury attorney whose reputation and wealth had afforded the family a lifestyle of comfort and prestige. The Sterns seemed to embody the American dream, their lives a portrait of success and stability. But beneath the polished surface of their marriage, dark currents were churning, and soon Yvonne would find herself caught in a nightmare that would test every ounce of her courage and will to survive. It began on a cold February night in 2010, when the tranquility of the Stern household was shattered by a sound that would forever change their lives. Gunfire erupted in the darkness, bullets tearing through the walls of their Bel Air home in a violent spray that seemed designed to kill. Yvonne and her 2 children were asleep upstairs when the shooting occurred, while Jeffrey was out of town on business. The bullets struck the first floor with terrifying precision, yet miraculously, no one was home on that level at the time. The family emerged physically unscathed, but the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Someone had tried to kill them, or so it seemed, in a drive-by shooting that left the house riddled with bullet holes. The police were called, reports were filed, but there were no clear suspects and no obvious motive. Jeffrey Stern, whose career as a personal injury lawyer had made him wealthy, but also potentially exposed him to dangerous elements, wondered if he might be the target. Had a disgruntled client or opposing party decided to take revenge? The family was left with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of dread that this was not an isolated incident. 2 months later, in April 2010, the terror returned with even greater intensity. This time, the attack was more direct, more personal, and far more frightening. Yvonne was at home with her family when the doorbell rang late at night. It was an unusual hour for visitors, but she went to answer it, perhaps thinking it was a neighbor or someone in need of help. As she approached the front door, she peered through the glass to see who was there. In that instant, a gunman on the other side raised his weapon and fired directly at her through the glass. The bullet screamed through the air, missing Yvonne by mere inches. It struck the floor with a violent crack and ricocheted off the opposite wall, leaving a scar in the plaster that would serve as a permanent reminder of how close death had come. Yvonne stood frozen, her heart pounding, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The gunman fled into the night, leaving behind only the echo of the gunshot and the shattered sense of security that the Stern family had once taken for granted. Now there could be no doubt. Someone was actively trying to kill Yvonne Stern, and they were willing to strike at her own home, with her children nearby. The realization was chilling. The police investigation intensified, but still, there were no clear leads. Jeffrey Stern, determined to protect his family, spared no expense in fortifying their home. He spent $75,000 installing more than half a dozen security cameras, powerful spotlights, and bulletproof glass for the front door. The house began to resemble a fortress, but the psychological damage was already done. Yvonne and her children moved to a nearby apartment while the security upgrades were completed, hoping that distance and precaution might keep them safe. But safety proved elusive. On a warm evening in May 2010, Yvonne Stern sat in her car in the parking garage of her new apartment complex, perhaps gathering her thoughts after a long day or preparing to head inside. She had moved here precisely to escape the danger that seemed to lurk around every corner of her former home. Yet danger had followed her. As she sat there, a figure approached from the shadows. Before she could react, a man was at her window, and she found herself staring down the barrel of a gun pointed directly at her head. Terror seized her. In that moment, with death so close she could see it reflected in the gunman's eyes, Yvonne did the only thing she could think of. She begged for her life. Through the window, with tears streaming down her face, she pleaded with the gunman, telling him about her children, about her new grandchild, about all the reasons she needed to live. Her words seemed to pierce through whatever cold resolve the gunman had mustered. He hesitated, the gun wavering in his hand. Then, in a moment that would haunt Yvonne for the rest of her life, he lowered the weapon from her head to her abdomen. He paused again, as if wrestling with his conscience or his orders, and then he fired. The bullet tore through Yvonne's purse and ripped into her stomach, lodging itself in her right hip. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but some survival instinct kicked in. Yvonne slumped over in her seat, playing dead, hoping the gunman would believe his job was done and leave. She remained motionless, barely breathing, as the gunman turned and walked away, then drove off into the night. Only when she was certain he was gone did Yvonne dare to move. Bleeding and in agony, she somehow managed to start her car and drive herself to a nearby gas station, where she collapsed and called for help. The paramedics arrived quickly, rushing her to the hospital where surgeons worked to save her life. She survived, but the bullet wound to her stomach was severe, and the psychological trauma was even deeper. Yvonne Stern had now survived 3 attempts on her life in just 4 months. The police investigation now moved with urgent intensity. 3 separate attempts to kill the same woman could not be coincidence, and detectives began to piece together a disturbing picture. Through witness statements, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence, they identified several suspects. The first major break came when they arrested Nhut Nguyen, a man who was charged with being the gunman in the second attempt, when Yvonne was shot at through her front door. In August 2011, Nguyen was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in prison. But the investigation did not stop there. Detectives had uncovered something even more shocking, evidence that pointed to a murder-for-hire plot, and at the center of it was a woman named Michelle Cabrera Geyser. Geyser, investigators discovered, had been having an affair with Jeffrey Stern. She was not just a casual lover. She had become obsessed with the idea of removing Yvonne from the picture, so she could have Jeffrey to herself. According to prosecutors, Geyser had orchestrated all 3 attempts on Yvonne's life, hiring different hitmen and providing them with detailed information about Yvonne's whereabouts, her daily routines, and what kind of car she drove. The third gunman, the one who had shot Yvonne in the parking garage, was identified as Damien Flores. Michelle Geyser had allegedly paid Flores $15,000 in cash as a down payment to murder Yvonne Stern. When arrested and confronted with the evidence, Geyser eventually confessed to her role in the murder-for-hire plot. She admitted to hiring hitmen, to providing them with the information they needed, and to paying them to kill a woman whose only crime was being married to the man Geyser loved. But the investigation revealed an even more stunning detail, one that would tear apart what remained of the Stern family's public image. Prosecutors believed that Jeffrey Stern himself had been involved in the plot to kill his wife. In January 2011, a grand jury indicted Jeffrey Stern on 2 counts of solicitation of capital murder. The indictments alleged that he had conspired with Michelle Geyser to have Yvonne killed, that he had encouraged and facilitated the murder attempts, and that he had used his mistress as the instrument of his wife's destruction. The evidence against Jeffrey Stern included recorded conversations with Michelle Geyser, in which they allegedly discussed the plot to kill Yvonne. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who wanted to be free of his marriage, but did not want to lose the financial assets that would come with a divorce. In their telling, Jeffrey Stern was a cold and calculating figure who had used his lover's obsession to orchestrate a series of murder attempts while maintaining the appearance of a concerned and loving husband. Jeffrey Stern vehemently denied all the allegations against him. His attorney, Paul Nugent, maintained that his client had nothing to do with the attempts on his wife's life, that he was being falsely accused by a vindictive and unstable woman who was trying to deflect blame for her own crimes. The case against Jeffrey Stern seemed to rest almost entirely on the testimony of Michelle Geyser, and as the legal proceedings continued, doubts began to emerge about her credibility. In the midst of all this legal drama, Yvonne Stern made a decision that stunned observers and added another layer of complexity to an already convoluted case. Despite the fact that prosecutors believed her husband had tried to have her killed, despite having filed for divorce citing adultery, Yvonne chose to stand by Jeffrey. She dropped the divorce proceedings and reconciled with her husband, moving back into their home and appearing alongside him at court hearings. Yvonne publicly declared that she did not believe Jeffrey had been involved in the plot against her. She testified in court, not against him, but in support of him, insisting that he was innocent of the charges. When asked about her decision, she told reporters that after all they had been through, their marriage was stronger than ever, full of love, honesty, and forgiveness. She had made a pros and cons list during a summer in Aspen, weighing her options, and had decided that her place was with her husband. Her decision was met with confusion and criticism from some quarters. How could a woman who had survived 3 murder attempts, who had been shot and nearly killed, stand by a man accused of orchestrating those very attacks? Some speculated that she was in denial, or that she was afraid, or that financial considerations were influencing her judgment. Others suggested that she genuinely believed in Jeffrey's innocence and was demonstrating a remarkable capacity for forgiveness and loyalty. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the cases against those accused in the murder-for-hire plot began to be resolved. Damian Flores, the gunman who had shot Yvonne in the parking garage, went to trial in November 2011. Michelle Geyser took the stand against him, sobbing throughout her testimony as she described how she had arranged for Flores to kill Yvonne, how she had given him the $15,000 down payment, and how she had provided him with all the information he needed to carry out the murder. Yvonne Stern also testified, recounting the terrifying moments when Flores had approached her car with a gun and she had begged for her life. The jury found Flores guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But as Jeffrey Stern's trial date approached in the summer of 2012, the case against him began to unravel. In June of that year, Stern's attorneys held a press conference to announce that they had evidence Michelle Geyser had been trying to have Jeffrey Stern killed from behind bars. They claimed that Geyser, angry that Jeffrey had reconciled with Yvonne and refused to support her, had written a letter attempting to hire a hitman to murder her former lover. While Geyser's attorneys insisted the letter was written out of frustration and was never meant to be acted upon, the revelation dealt a severe blow to her credibility as the prosecution's key witness. On July 23, 2012, just days before Jeffrey Stern was scheduled to go to trial, prosecutors made a stunning announcement. They were dropping all charges against him. In a statement, First Assistant District Attorney Jim Leitner explained that upon final review, they had concluded the available evidence was not sufficient to justify taking the case to trial. The prosecution's case had hinged almost entirely on Michelle Geyser's testimony, and her credibility had been so thoroughly undermined by the revelation of her attempt to have Jeffrey killed from jail that they could no longer proceed. Jeffrey Stern's attorney, Paul Nugent, issued a statement saying that the prosecution had realized there was not credible evidence to proceed and had done the right thing by dismissing the charges. The Stern family, through their attorney, expressed relief and gratitude that their 2-year nightmare was over. 3 days after the charges against Jeffrey Stern were dropped, Michelle Geyser appeared in court to enter a guilty plea to solicitation of capital murder. As part of a plea agreement, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The deal included her cooperation with prosecutors, which had led to the identification and conviction of Damian Flores, the gunman who had shot Yvonne. In addition to her prison sentence, Geyser's conviction would eventually result in her deportation. Yvonne Stern was present at Geyser's sentencing, and she addressed the court with a victim impact statement that revealed the depth of her pain and anger. Her voice cracking with emotion, she read, "I beg you for the sake of my children and my sense of security to reject this 20-year deal. I have suffered for over 2 years due to this animal and remain scarred for life." Despite Yvonne's plea, the judge accepted the plea agreement. Yvonne's attorney announced that she had filed a civil lawsuit against Geyser, hoping to find justice in the civil courts that she felt had not been fully achieved in the criminal system. In total, 4 people were convicted and sent to prison for their roles in the attempts to murder Yvonne Stern, with combined sentences totaling 95 years. But the question that lingered in the minds of many who followed the case was whether the true mastermind behind the plot had escaped justice. Was Michelle Geyser a woman driven by obsessive love who had acted alone, or had she been manipulated by Jeffrey Stern into carrying out his wishes? The truth, like so much in this case, remained elusive and subject to interpretation. In the years following the resolution of the criminal cases, Yvonne and Jeffrey Stern worked to rebuild their lives and their marriage. They remained together, presenting a united front to the world and insisting that their bond had been strengthened rather than broken by the ordeal. Yvonne bore physical and emotional scars from her experience, a bullet wound in her abdomen that would never fully heal, and the psychological trauma of having survived 3 attempts on her life. But she also spoke of forgiveness, of moving forward, and of finding peace in the midst of unimaginable tragedy. The Stern case became one of the most unusual and controversial criminal cases in American legal history, a tangled web of love, betrayal, violence, and ambiguity. It raised profound questions about justice, about the nature of truth, and about the choices people make when faced with impossible situations. For Yvonne Stern, it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the will to survive, and to the capacity for forgiveness, even in the face of the darkest betrayal. The bulletproof glass that Jeffrey had installed on their front door remained in place, a permanent reminder of the terror that had once invaded their home. But it also stood as a symbol of survival, of a woman who had stared death in the face 3 times and refused to be defeated. Yvonne Stern's story is one of courage and resilience, of a life shattered and then painstakingly pieced back together. Whether justice was fully served remains a matter of debate, but there is no debate about the remarkable strength of the woman at the center of it all. Story 5. Winter break was supposed to be a time of joy and reunion. For 19-year-old Blaze Bernstein, it meant coming home to Orange County, California, from the University of Pennsylvania, where he had just completed his first semester of sophomore year. The young man who walked through the door of his family's home in Foothill Ranch carried with him the weight of academic excellence, creative ambition, and the quiet confidence of someone who had found his voice in the world of words. His parents, Gene Pepper and Gideon Bernstein, along with his younger siblings, welcomed him back with open arms, eager to spend precious time with the eldest son they admired and adored. Blaze was not an ordinary student. He had always been extraordinary in ways both visible and subtle. From his early years, he demonstrated an insatiable curiosity about the world, a hunger for knowledge that led him to explore everything from molecular science to the alchemy of cooking. At the Orange County School of the Arts, he had thrived in the Creative Writing Conservatory, a program that shaped his raw talent into something formidable. His teachers remembered him as a writer's writer, someone who approached language with both precision and passion, crafting sentences that burst with energy and meaning. When he arrived at Penn, he had not yet declared a major, but his path seemed clear to those who knew him. He would balance his love for science with his devotion to the written word, perhaps becoming a food scientist and writer who could bridge both worlds. At Penn, Blaze had already begun to make his mark. He was the incoming managing editor of Penn Appetit, the student-run food magazine that allowed him to merge his twin passions for chemistry and cuisine. He wrote opinion columns for the Daily Pennsylvanian and worked as a copy associate for both 34th Street magazine and the Penn Review. His colleagues remembered him as an opinionated critic whose edits, though sharp, were always delivered with kindness and compassion, particularly when working with newer writers. He had even achieved something remarkable before setting foot on campus. He became the first high school student among the hundreds recruited each year to be published in one of Penn's literary magazines. In his piece titled "Picking Marbles from Dirt," he had described his writing process with characteristic intensity. "I write until I can't write anymore, until the page is bursting with so many words and letters and syllables that if I were to fit one more period into the end of a sentence, the entire page might just burst." His family knew him as their Renaissance man, intelligent and loving, with interests that seemed to span every corner of human experience. They had always been supportive of every aspect of who he was. When they sensed that Blaze was gay, they went to him directly, telling him, "We love you and want you to have a good life and be happy." His father Gideon later explained that Blaze's sexual identity was no different from his other identities, simply one part of the beautiful, complex person he had become. It was this openness, this authenticity, that made Blaze so beloved by those who knew him. He was comfortable in his own skin, ready to embrace the world on his own terms. On the evening of January 2nd, 2018, Blaze made plans to meet with someone from his past. Samuel Woodward had been a classmate at the Orange County School of the Arts, though their connection had been casual at best during those high school years. Now 20 years old, Woodward lived a life that stood in stark contrast to Blaze's trajectory of achievement and openness. Where Blaze had flourished in the creative conservatory, pursuing art and expression, Woodward had struggled with social connections and found himself drawn to darker ideologies. He had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at age 18, a late diagnosis that his family and later his defense team would argue had left him vulnerable and socially isolated. That night, Blaze sent his address to Woodward via Snapchat, and Woodward arrived to pick him up. The two young men drove through the quiet streets of Lake Forest, heading toward Borrego Park, a local recreation area bordered by wilderness. It was approaching 11 o'clock when they arrived at the parking lot. The park was dark and empty, the kind of place that felt peaceful during the day, but took on an eerie quality after sunset. Blaze had told Woodward he wanted to go to the park, though the exact reasons for the meeting remained unclear. What happened in those dark hours would become a matter of investigation, testimony, and ultimately, a conviction that would send shockwaves through communities concerned with hate crimes and extremism. The two had been communicating through dating apps in the months before. On that night, as they sat in the car at Borrego Park, something shifted. Blaze had been taunting Woodward, threatening to expose his sexuality. He accused Blaze of assault, though no evidence would ever support this claim. What is known, what became undeniable through forensic evidence and investigation, is that Woodward reached for a knife he kept in his vehicle, a blade he said he routinely carried from his days as a Boy Scout. In a frenzy that he himself described as uncontrollable, he drove the knife into Blaze again and again. When Blaze failed to appear for a dentist appointment on January 3rd, his parents knew immediately that something was wrong. It was not like their son to miss appointments or fail to respond to messages. Jean and Gideon went to his room and found his wallet, keys, and glasses still sitting where he had left them. The credit cards were untouched. Every physical piece of his daily life remained in the house, but Blaze himself had vanished. Panic began to set in as they searched through his computer and social media accounts, desperate for any clue about where he might have gone. On Snapchat, they discovered messages between Blaze and Samuel Woodward. The exchange showed that Blaze had sent his address to Woodward the previous night. Gideon Bernstein reached out to Woodward directly, asking if he knew where Blaze was. Woodward's response was calm and seemingly helpful. He explained that he had picked Blaze up and driven to Borrego Park, but that Blaze had then walked off into the darkness to meet another friend. Woodward claimed he had waited, but eventually left when Blaze didn't return. The story was specific enough to be believable, vague enough to deflect responsibility. The Orange County Sheriff's Department launched a search operation. Approximately 25 members of the department's search and rescue team surveyed Borrego Park and the adjacent Whiting Ranch wilderness area. They combed through brush and trails, calling Blaze's name, looking for any sign of the missing student. Days passed with no results. The family held on to hope, posting on social media, organizing volunteer search parties, praying for a miracle. But as the hours turned into days, that hope began to feel increasingly fragile. On January 9th, 2018, after days of searching, nature itself revealed what investigators had been unable to find. Heavy rains had swept through Orange County, soaking the earth and shifting the ground in Borrego Park. The downpour had exposed something hidden in the brush at the perimeter of the park. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, sheriff's investigators made the discovery that would transform the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide. Blaze's body was found buried in a shallow grave, partially uncovered by the relentless rain. The sight was devastating. Blaze had been stabbed more than 20 times, with wounds concentrated in his face and neck. The brutality of the attack spoke to a rage that went beyond self-defense or accident. This was personal, violent, and sustained. Near his body, investigators recovered Blaze's damaged cell phone, a piece of evidence that would later prove crucial in reconstructing the timeline of that terrible night. Lieutenant Brad Valentine, who served as chief of police services for Lake Forest, told reporters that based on the evidence, he believed Blaze had been killed on the night he disappeared. The news shattered the Bernstein family. Their vibrant, talented son, who had been home for winter break with so much life ahead of him, was gone. The young man who wrote with such passion, who cooked with scientific precision, who balanced molecular science with creative writing, would never return to pen. He would never see his work published in Pen Appetit's cookbook project, never graduate, never fulfill the extraordinary promise that everyone who knew him recognized. For his younger sister Beau, who had just begun to grow closer to her older brother after years of typical sibling contentions, the loss was particularly cruel. She had finally reached an age where they could connect as friends, and now he was gone forever. Investigators focused their attention on Samuel Woodward. He had been the last person to see Blaze alive, and his story about dropping him off to meet another friend had begun to unravel under scrutiny. On January 12, 2018, authorities served a search warrant at Woodward's home in Newport Beach. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of the young man, who had claimed to be merely a helpful acquaintance giving an old classmate a ride. Inside Woodward's residence, investigators found evidence that would fundamentally change the nature of the case. His phone, laptop, and social media accounts revealed a worldview consumed by hatred. Woodward had become involved with the Atomwaffen Division, a neo-Nazi terrorist organization dedicated to overthrowing the U.S. government through violence and guerrilla warfare. The group's ideology was built on white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and violent extremism. Members trained with firearms, discussed bombings, and targeted power infrastructure and religious institutions. Woodward had not just been a passive member. According to people familiar with his activities, he had helped organize other Atomwaffen members in California and had traveled to Texas for weapons training. The digital evidence showed that Woodward openly described himself as a National Socialist, embracing Nazi ideology without reservation. One acquaintance later told investigators that Woodward was as anti-Semitic as you can get. The realization hit the Bernstein family with crushing force. Their son had been murdered not just by someone he knew, but by someone who hated what he represented. Blaze was gay and Jewish, two identities that made him a target for the violent extremism that Woodward had embraced. On February 2, 2018, Samuel Woodward was arraigned and pleaded not guilty to the murder charge. But as investigators continued to analyze the evidence, they became convinced that this was more than a simple homicide. On August 2, 2018, the Orange County District Attorney's Office added a hate crime enhancement to the charges. Prosecutors argued that Woodward had killed Blaze with premeditation specifically because Blaze was gay. The evidence from Woodward's devices, combined with his membership in a terrorist organization built on hatred, supported the theory that this had been a targeted killing motivated by bigotry. For the Bernstein family, learning about the hate crime enhancement brought a new dimension of pain. Gideon Bernstein spoke publicly about the anguish of realizing that his son had been killed not for anything he had done, but simply for who he was as a human being. It was one thing to lose a child to violence. It was another to know that the violence had been rooted in hatred for his very identity. The hate crime enhancement also meant that if convicted, Woodward would face life in prison without the possibility of parole rather than a determinate sentence. The path to trial was long and complicated. Woodward was denied bail and remained in custody as the case slowly moved through the legal system. Years passed as both sides prepared their arguments. The prosecution gathered evidence of premeditation and hate, building a narrative of a violent extremist who had murdered someone because of prejudice. The defense prepared to argue that Woodward's autism spectrum disorder had left him socially vulnerable and unable to fully understand his actions, and that the killing had been a spontaneous act of panic rather than a premeditated hate crime. When the trial finally began in 2024, more than 6 years after Blaze's death, the proceedings stretched across nearly 3 months. The courtroom became a space where two narratives collided: the prosecution's account of a hate-fueled murder committed by a radicalized extremist, and the defense's portrayal of a socially isolated young man with autism who had lashed out in a moment of fear and confusion. Samuel Woodward spent 5 days on the witness stand, a testimony marked by long pauses and halting responses. He often took up to 30 seconds to answer simple yes or no questions, a behavior his defense attorney Ken Morrison attributed to the communication difficulties associated with autism. Woodward testified that on the night of the killing, he and Blaze had been in the car at Borrego Park when Blaze began taunting him. According to Woodward, Blaze threatened to expose his sexuality and made unwanted advances that constituted assault, though prosecutors emphasized that no evidence supported these claims. Woodward described a moment of panic and rage, saying that he feared Blaze had recorded him or sent text messages exposing him. He reached for the knife and attacked, describing the violence in chilling terms. "I couldn't stop going at the phone. I couldn't see what was going on. At that point the phone wasn't even in the way anymore. Nothing was in the way anymore. I just kept driving and driving and driving the knife down." The testimony painted a picture of sustained, frenzied violence that resulted in Blaze being stabbed 28 times. Ken Morrison, Woodward's public defender, built his case around the argument that his client's autism had made him vulnerable to radicalization and unable to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder with a hate crime enhancement. Morrison emphasized that Woodward had not been diagnosed with autism until he was 18, too late for the interventions that might have helped him develop better social skills and judgment. The disorder had made him lonely and desperate for connection, Morrison argued, making him susceptible to the acceptance he found in extremist online communities. Morrison was careful to state that he was not trying to excuse the crime, but rather to help the jury understand Woodward's state of mind. He argued that the case had been overcharged and that Woodward should be held accountable for manslaughter rather than first-degree murder with hate crime enhancements. The defense sought to separate the killing itself from the ideology Woodward had embraced, suggesting that the murder had been a spontaneous act rather than a premeditated hate crime. The prosecution, however, presented extensive evidence of Woodward's extremist beliefs and his membership in a Atomwaffen division. They argued that someone deeply embedded in a neo-Nazi terrorist organization, someone who openly expressed virulent anti-Semitism and who had trained with weapons, had not killed randomly or impulsively. The combination of Blaze's identities as a gay Jewish man and Woodward's documented hatred toward both groups created a clear motive rooted in prejudice. The prosecution maintained that this was precisely what hate crime laws were designed to address: violence committed because of who the victim was, not because of what they had done. On July 3, 2024, more than 6 years after Blaze's death, the jury delivered their verdict. Samuel Woodward was found guilty of first-degree murder with a hate crime enhancement. The decision affirmed what prosecutors had argued throughout the trial: that Blaze Bernstein had been killed because he was gay and Jewish, targeted by someone whose worldview was built on hatred. For the Bernstein family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though it could never bring back their son. The sentencing hearing took place on November 15, 2024. Woodward, who was absent from court due to illness, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no ambiguity in the sentence. The jury's verdict had mandated this outcome. Ken Morrison requested a lesser sentence of 28 years to life, arguing that the judge had some discretion and that jurors had not been privy to all the evidence. He indicated plans to appeal the verdict, but for now, the legal process had reached its conclusion. Samuel Woodward, who was 20 years old at the time of the murder and 27 at sentencing, would spend the rest of his life in prison. The case of Blaise Bernstein stands as a stark reminder of the real-world consequences of hatred and extremism. It reveals how ideologies of bigotry can move from online forums and extremist chat rooms into acts of devastating violence. Samuel Woodward's involvement with the Atomwaffen division was not simply a matter of misguided beliefs or youthful rebellion. It was participation in a terrorist organization that explicitly advocated violence against targeted groups. When those beliefs encountered a real person who represented what the ideology taught him to hate, the result was murder. Blaise Bernstein's life was marked by creativity, intelligence, compassion, and authenticity. He pursued his passions with intensity, whether he was writing until pages burst with words, experimenting with the chemistry of cooking, or editing his peers' work with sharp but kind precision. He was open about who he was, supported by a family that loved him unconditionally. He should have had decades ahead of him to write more stories, cook more meals, make more friends, and contribute his unique voice to the world. Instead, his life ended in violence in a dark park, killed by someone who saw him not as a person, but as a symbol of everything his hateful ideology rejected. The legacy that remains is twofold: the memory of a remarkable young man whose potential was never fully realized, and a legal precedent that affirmed the seriousness of hate crimes and the need to hold perpetrators accountable not just for violence, but for the bigotry that motivates it. In the Bernstein family's words, Blaise's life mattered. That simple statement carries the weight of their love for their son and their determination that his death would not be forgotten or dismissed. Through their advocacy, through the memorial fund that bears his name, and through the countless lives he touched in his 19 years, Blaise Bernstein continues to matter. Story 6. The air in Reno, Nevada, carried a crisp bite that January evening in 2008. The kind of cold that reminded residents winter still held the high desert firmly in its grip. Brianna Dennison, just 19 years old, had returned to her hometown for winter break from Santa Barbara City College in California, eager to reconnect with old friends and escape the demands of sophomore year. She had spent the evening doing exactly what young people do: going to a concert, laughing with friends, visiting late-night spots, soaking up the energy of familiar faces and familiar places. By the time the group made their way back to a rental house on Mackenzie Street, just off the University of Nevada, Reno campus, it was the early hours of January 20th, 2008. Exhaustion had settled into Brianna's bones, and when they arrived at the house around 4 in the morning, she claimed the couch in the living room, too tired to make the journey to a proper bed. She wore simple, comfortable clothes, sweatpants and a t-shirt, as she curled up on that couch, her breathing gradually slowing into the rhythm of sleep. Her friend Katie Hunter retired to a bedroom upstairs, and the house fell into the quiet stillness that settles over a home when everyone has finally surrendered to sleep. Outside, the street remained dark and silent, the winter night stretching long before dawn would break. None of them could have known that someone was watching, waiting, calculating. None of them could have imagined that when morning came, Brianna would be gone. When Katie Hunter descended the stairs later that morning, she expected to find Brianna still asleep on the couch, perhaps stirring as sunlight filtered through the windows. Instead, she found an empty couch, the blanket disturbed, and her friend nowhere to be seen. At first, there might have been a moment of confusion. Had Brianna left early? Had she gone for a walk? But as the minutes ticked by and calls to Brianna's phone went unanswered, confusion transformed into something darker, something that settled like ice in the pit of the stomach. By the time the Reno Police Department received the missing person report, investigators already sensed this was no ordinary disappearance. The evidence they discovered at the Mackenzie Street house confirmed their worst fears. Touch DNA recovered from a rear doorknob belonged to an unknown individual. More significantly, DNA found on the couch where Brianna had been sleeping matched genetic material from at least 2 previous attacks in the same neighborhood. One on November 13, 2007, and another on December 16, 2007. The realization hit investigators with the weight of a hammer blow. Brianna Dennison had not simply wandered off or been the victim of a random crime. She had been taken by a serial predator who had been hunting women near the university campus for months. On January 21, 2008, just one day after Brianna vanished, detectives began an intensive search of the University of Nevada, Reno area. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the effort, bringing federal resources to bear on a case that was rapidly becoming a community nightmare. Police revealed to the public what they knew. Brianna's abduction was connected to a string of attacks on women near the campus, including at least one brazen assault in which a woman had been attacked at gunpoint in a parking garage where campus police parked their cruisers. Based on partial descriptions from previous victims, investigators developed a profile of their suspect. A white male between ages 28 and 40, at least 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a long face and brown hair, no distinguishable accent or regional dialect. The Reno community responded with an outpouring of support that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Hundreds of volunteers joined search efforts, combing through neighborhoods, fields, and vacant lots. Blue ribbons, Brianna's favorite color, began appearing throughout the city as residents wore them in solidarity, a sea of azure symbolizing hope that somehow, against all odds, Brianna would be found alive. Billboards featuring her photograph went up across Reno, her face becoming hauntingly familiar to everyone who drove the city's streets. The Dennison family, Brianna's mother Bridget, her brother Brighton, and extended relatives, made tearful public appeals, begging anyone with information to come forward. The case consumed the community, transforming Brianna into what her family would later call the daughter of our entire community. But as days turned into weeks and January's cold gave way to February's continued chill, hope began to fade like winter sunlight through heavy clouds. Then, on February 15, 2008, 26 days after Brianna disappeared, a construction worker named Harold Jimenez made a discovery that would end the agonizing uncertainty, but plunge the community into grief. Jimenez was working at a business park in South Reno, approximately 8 miles from the Mackenzie Street house, when he noticed something in a vacant field near EE Technologies, where he was employed. What he initially thought was a mannequin turned out to be something far more terrible. The body of a young woman, naked except for socks, partially concealed beneath a discarded Christmas tree. Jimenez, who did not have a cell phone, rushed back to his workplace to call the Reno police. When officers arrived at the scene, they confirmed what Jimenez had feared but tried not to believe. The victim was Brianna Dennison. Heavy snowfall over the previous weeks had likely delayed the discovery of her body, covering the field in white and concealing the horror that lay beneath. An autopsy conducted on February 16, 2008, revealed that Brianna had been strangled, her life stolen in an act of violence that had stripped her not only of breath but of dignity. The medical examiner determined she had been left in that field at least a week before her body was found, meaning she had died shortly after her abduction. Near Brianna's body, investigators found evidence that would become crucial to the case, but would also haunt the community with its implications. 2 pairs of women's thong underwear were discovered at the scene. One pair was particularly distinctive, black with stitchings of the Pink Panther cartoon character and pink hearts on the fabric. These underwear did not belong to Brianna, and forensic analysis revealed they contained DNA from 2 sources: the serial rapist linked to previous attacks and an unknown woman. Reno Police Chief Michael Pullman told reporters the underwear was a critical piece of evidence, possibly left at the scene to taunt police or perhaps dropped accidentally by the killer. Investigators also determined that 2 other assault victims had reported their attackers took their underwear, suggesting the killer kept trophies from his crimes. The revelation that Brianna had been murdered by a serial predator, who was still at large, sent shockwaves through Reno. Women near the university campus lived in fear, altering their routines, installing extra locks, never walking alone after dark. A candlelight vigil held near the field where Brianna's body was found drew hundreds of people, including dozens of volunteers who had participated in the month-long search. Signs left at a makeshift memorial spoke to the profound impact of the tragedy. "You changed a community. You changed a nation. We will never forget you," read one. Another, signed by search volunteers, proclaimed, "Bree, you were your mother's daughter. Now you are our sister and daughter." Reno Mayor Bob Cashel assured the grieving community that local police and the FBI were doing everything we can to bring this monster to justice. As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, the investigation continued, but leads ran cold. Months passed without an arrest. Then, in early November 2008, nearly 10 months after Brianna's murder, investigators received an anonymous tip through the secret witness tip line. The caller provided information that led detectives to James Michael Bila, a 27-year-old construction worker and pipe fitter from Sparks, Nevada. Bila, who had previous encounters with law enforcement, including a 2001 arrest for threatening his former girlfriend's neighbor with a knife, became the focus of an intensive investigation. On November 7, 2008, Detective David Jenkins met with Bila and asked him to provide a DNA sample. Bila refused, but investigators had another avenue to pursue. Bila had a girlfriend named Carlene Harmon, and together they had a 4-year-old son. When detectives approached Harmon and explained the situation, she made a decision that would ultimately bring her son's father to justice. She gave police permission to obtain a DNA sample from the child. The science of familial DNA testing provided the breakthrough investigators needed. Forensic experts compared the boy's DNA to evidence collected from the December 2007 attack and from the Mackenzie Street house where Brianna had been abducted. The results indicated that the child's biological father, James Bila, could not be excluded as the source of DNA found at both crime scenes. Armed with this evidence, Reno police obtained warrants for Bila's arrest and for his DNA. On Tuesday, November 25, 2008, Thanksgiving week, detectives moved in. Bila, who had been under surveillance, was arrested while dropping his son off at the Stepping Stones Children's Center in Reno. A DNA sample collected directly from Bila confirmed what investigators already suspected. He was the serial rapist who had terrorized the university area for months, and he was the man who had murdered Brianna Dennison. He was booked into the Washoe County Jail on charges of murder, first-degree kidnapping, and sexual assault. As the case against James Bila developed, the full scope of his crimes became clear. He was charged not only with Brianna's murder, but also with attacking 2 other women in 2007, assaults that occurred in October and December of that year. Evidence presented by prosecutors painted a chilling picture of a predator who had entered homes through unlocked doors, targeted vulnerable women, and committed acts of violence that forever altered his victims' lives. In Brianna's case, investigators believed Bila had entered the Mackenzie Street house through an unlocked door in the early morning hours of January 20, 2008, pressed a pillow to her face to silence her, and carried her from the house. He had then assaulted and murdered her, strangling her with the strap of a pair of thong underwear. Her body had been dumped in a ravine in South Reno, left beneath that discarded Christmas tree like refuse. James Bila, a former Marine trained in martial arts, initially pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense team would later attempt to suppress the DNA evidence obtained from his son, arguing it violated his rights. But Judge Robert Perry ruled the evidence was admissible, noting that the boy's mother, Bila's girlfriend, had legally consented to providing the sample. The decision cleared the way for prosecutors to present their case at trial. On May 27, 2010, more than 2 years after Brianna's body had been found in that frozen field, James Biela's trial reached its conclusion. After deliberating for approximately 6 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Biela was convicted of the murder of Brianna Dennison, as well as kidnapping and sexual assault charges related to attacks on 2 other women in 2007. The trial immediately moved into its penalty phase, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty. The defense attempted to present mitigating factors that might spare Biela's life. His attorneys argued that he had suffered an abusive childhood at the hands of an alcoholic father, that he had been a productive member of society before his crimes, and that he had been a model prisoner since his arrest. But the jury, tasked with weighing these factors against the heinous nature of Biela's crimes and the continuing threat he posed to society, was not persuaded. On June 2, 2010, the jury returned a special verdict of death. Judge Robert Perry subsequently sentenced Biela to death for Brianna's murder and, on July 30, 2010, added for additional life sentences for the other counts of rape and kidnapping. Brianna Dennison's family, who had endured more than 2 years of agonizing legal proceedings, finally saw justice delivered. But no verdict, no sentence, could restore what had been stolen from them. Brianna, known as Bree to those who loved her, had been a sophomore pursuing her education, building her future, living with the optimism and dreams that characterized her 19 years. She had been a kind, beautiful young woman whose favorite color was blue, whose smile lit up rooms, whose presence had touched everyone fortunate enough to know her. The community that had embraced her family during the darkest days of searching, that had worn blue ribbons and attended vigils and signed messages of love and solidarity, mourned not only for what Brianna had been but for all she would never become. James Biela filed appeals to the Nevada Supreme Court, challenging his convictions and death sentence. In 2012, the Nevada Supreme Court affirmed both his convictions and his sentence. Further appeals followed, winding through the complex machinery of death penalty litigation, but as of years after his sentencing, Biela remained on death row. His only stated regret, according to reports, was that he would not see his son grow up, a sentiment that rang particularly hollow given that his actions had robbed Brianna Dennison of her entire future and left countless others traumatized. The case of Brianna Dennison serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability that exists even in places that should be safe, even among friends, even in the warmth of a living room on a cold winter night. It speaks to the courage of victims who came forward to report attacks, providing the DNA evidence that would eventually link their assaults to Brianna's murder. It honors the determination of investigators who refused to let the case go cold, who pursued every lead, who built a case strong enough to secure justice. And it pays tribute to a girlfriend and mother who, faced with an impossible choice, chose truth over loyalty to a man who had betrayed every principle of human decency. Most importantly, the case ensures that Brianna Dennison will never be forgotten, not as a victim reduced to statistics in a criminal justice file, but as a young woman who deserved to finish her education, to pursue her dreams, to fall in love, to build a career, to laugh with friends over coffee decades from now, to grow old surrounded by people who cherished her. The blue ribbons that once flooded Reno in desperate hope have become symbols of remembrance, reminders that Brianna's life mattered, that her death demanded justice, and that a community can come together in the face of unspeakable tragedy to declare that violence will not define them. Memory, love, and the pursuit of justice will. Story 7. The pre-dawn coolness of a late summer morning in Memphis, Tennessee, held a particular kind of peace. On Friday, September 2nd, 2022, the city was still asleep, its streets bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of streetlights. In the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Central Gardens, a light switched on in one of the grand, historic homes. For Eliza Fletcher, this was the best time of day. The world was still, the air was fresh, and the day held the clean, untouched promise of a blank page. At 34 years old, Eliza, or Liza to her family and friends, had built a life of joyful purpose. She was a dedicated junior kindergarten teacher at St. Mary's Episcopal School, a wife to her husband, Richie, and the loving mother of 2 young sons. Liza was a woman of routine and discipline, traits she applied with equal vigor to her passion for running. A marathoner, she found a sense of freedom and clarity on the open road. Her morning run was a sacred ritual, a time to herself before the happy chaos of family life and the demands of a classroom full of 5-year-olds began. That morning, her plan was the usual, a familiar out-and-back route of about 8 miles, a path she had traced countless times. Dressed in a pink running top and blue shorts, she tied her sneakers, clipped her phone to her side, and stepped out into the quiet dark around 4 a.m. The city was her own private track at this hour, a place of solitude and rhythmic motion. Her route took her west, towards the sprawling campus of the University of Memphis. The streets were empty, save for the occasional passing car. The sound of her own breathing and the soft, steady percussion of her footsteps on the pavement were the only soundtrack to the unfolding day. She was a picture of dedication, a familiar sight to the few other early risers in the area. But on this morning, a shadow was stalking the edges of the city's slumber. A dark-colored SUV, a GMC Terrain, was prowling the same streets, its driver scanning the pre-dawn quiet not for peace, but for opportunity. As Eliza ran near the intersection of Central Avenue and Zach H. Curlin Street, a stretch of road bordering the university campus, the SUV made its move. It was approximately 4:20 a.m. University surveillance cameras, silent and unblinking witnesses, would later capture the terrifying swiftness of the attack. The vehicle sped ahead of her, then waited. As she approached, a man burst out of the passenger side and ran aggressively toward her. The sudden, violent disruption of her rhythmic stride was absolute. A struggle ensued, brief but desperate. Eliza, strong and athletic, fought back against her assailant. But the man was larger, more powerful, and driven by a brutal intent. He forced her, struggling, into the passenger seat of the SUV. The vehicle then sat in a nearby parking lot for several minutes before driving away, vanishing with Eliza into the remaining darkness. The entire abduction took only seconds. The street fell silent again, as if nothing had happened. The first tendrils of panic began to curl around Richie Fletcher's heart. Around 7 a.m. Liza was not home. Her morning runs were predictable, almost to the minute. A delay was unusual. A complete absence was unthinkable. He tried her phone, but there was no answer. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. By 7:45 a.m., that dread had bloomed into full-blown alarm. He called the Memphis Police Department and reported his wife missing. The ordinary rhythm of a Friday morning in the Fletcher household had been shattered. The initial police response was swift. Officers arrived at the scene of her last known location, near the university campus. There, a cyclist who had been passing by had already made a discovery. On the ground, he had found Eliza's cell phone and a water bottle. He had turned them over to the university police, who then handed them to the Memphis PD. The phone was smashed, a sign of the violence that had taken place. The discovery confirmed Richie's worst fears. This was not a simple case of a runner who had lost track of time. This was something far more sinister. Investigators immediately began canvassing the area for evidence. At the scene of the abduction, they found another crucial clue, a pair of Champion slide sandals. They did not belong to Eliza. The sandals were bagged as evidence, a seemingly innocuous item that would soon become the linchpin of the entire investigation. The police also secured surveillance footage from a nearby university building. The grainy video told a chilling story. It showed a dark-colored GMC Terrain, and it captured the brutal, fleeting moments of the struggle. Eliza Fletcher had been abducted. The news spread like wildfire through Memphis. Eliza was not just any citizen. She was the granddaughter of the late Joseph Joe Orgel III, a hardware magnate and philanthropist whose company, Orgel Incorporated, was a multi-billion-dollar enterprise and a cornerstone of the Memphis business community. While Eliza lived a relatively private life, her family's prominence meant her disappearance was instantly high profile. But to the community, she was Liza, the beloved kindergarten teacher, the mother, the friend, the runner. Her abduction felt like an attack on the city itself. A massive search was launched. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the FBI were called in to assist the Memphis police. A frantic, desperate race against time had begun. The search area expanded outward from the abduction site, a grim ripple in a pond of fear. Officers on foot, in patrol cars, and in helicopters scoured the city. Volunteers, friends, and family joined the effort, their faces etched with worry, calling her name into empty lots and wooded areas. The city held its breath, praying for a miracle. Meanwhile, forensic technicians at the state crime lab were working urgently on the evidence from the scene. The champion sandals were a priority. They were tested for DNA. The results came back with a match, a name pulled from the Cody's database, a national repository of DNA profiles from convicted offenders. The name was Cleatha Abston. The focus of the investigation narrowed with blinding speed. The phantom in the grainy video now had a name and a face. Investigators quickly learned that Cleatha Abston, who also went by the last name Henderson, was 38 years old and had a violent criminal history. He had been released from prison in 2020 after serving 20 years for an aggravated kidnapping he committed when he was a teenager. The crime was eerily similar. He had abducted a Memphis lawyer at gunpoint, forced him into the trunk of a car, and drove him around to various ATMs to withdraw cash. The fact that he was out on the streets, free to offend again, sent a chill through the law enforcement community. The manhunt for Abston and the GMC terrain began in earnest. Police tracked the vehicle's movements using cell phone data and more surveillance footage. They discovered that Abston had been seen driving the SUV in the hours after the abduction. On Friday afternoon, he was captured on camera at a gas station, where he appeared to be cleaning the interior of the vehicle. This was a critical piece of information. It suggested he was destroying evidence. The urgency of finding him and finding Eliza intensified. On Saturday morning, just over 24 hours after the abduction, members of a U.S. Marshals Task Force spotted the GMC terrain in a parking lot outside an apartment complex in South Memphis where Abston was known to stay. They moved in. Abston attempted to flee, but he was apprehended quickly. He was taken into custody, but he refused to talk. When questioned about Eliza Fletcher, he remained silent, a stone wall of defiance. He would not tell them where she was. The arrest of a suspect was a significant breakthrough, but it did not bring relief. It only deepened the mystery and the fear. Eliza was still missing. The clock was ticking, every passing minute a blow to the fading hope that she might be found alive. The search now had a new grim focus. Investigators believed that Abston's brother, Mario, had been with him in the hours after the kidnapping. They brought him in for questioning. Mario told police that he had seen his brother cleaning the GMC terrain and acting strangely. He said Cleatha had been washing his clothes in the sink, a detail that further suggested an attempt to destroy evidence. But he too claimed he did not know where Eliza was. The search continued, now concentrated in the areas of South Memphis that Abston was known to frequent. The hope for a rescue was dwindling, replaced by a grim preparation for the worst. The city waited, its collective heart heavy with a terrible premonition. The search for Eliza Fletcher stretched into a third agonizing day. The hope that had buoyed the community in the initial hours had begun to fray, worn thin by the silence from her abductor and the lack of any new leads on her whereabouts. The investigation had become a meticulous, painstaking grid search of South Memphis, an area Cleatha Abston knew well. Law enforcement officers, their faces grim and determined, moved through overgrown lots, peered into abandoned buildings, and traced the paths that a killer might take to dispose of his victim. On the afternoon of Monday, September 5th, the search led a team of officers to a dilapidated residential area not far from where Abston had been staying. As one officer walked past a vacant duplex on Victor Street, a foul odor hung heavy in the humid late summer air. His training and experience told him what that smell meant. He followed it to the back of the property, to an area where the grass was tall and unkempt. And there, behind the building, he saw it. The body of a woman, partially concealed by the overgrown weeds. The search was over. The worst fears of her family, her friends, and an entire city had been realized. The scene was quickly secured. Forensic examiners confirmed the identity through dental records. It was Eliza Fletcher. The autopsy would later reveal the brutal details of her final moments. Eliza Fletcher had died from a gunshot wound to the back of her head. She also had blunt force injuries to her leg and jaw fractures, evidence of the violent struggle she had put up against her attacker. The date and time of her death were officially listed as the date and time her body was found, but it was clear that her life had likely ended long before, in the dark, desperate hours after her abduction. With the discovery of Eliza's body, the charges against Cleatha Abston were upgraded. He now faced first-degree murder, murder in the perpetration of a kidnapping and tampering with evidence, in addition to the initial charge of especially aggravated kidnapping. The Shelby County District Attorney's Office announced they would be seeking the death penalty. As the city grappled with the senselessness of the tragedy, a disturbing and infuriating subplot to the case began to emerge, one that pointed to a catastrophic failure within the very system that was supposed to protect the public from men like Abston. While investigating him for Eliza's murder, police connected his DNA to another violent crime, one that had occurred almost a full year earlier. On September 21, 2021, a young woman named Alicia Franklin had been raped at gunpoint in Memphis. She had promptly reported the attack to the police, and a sexual assault kit was collected. That kit contained the DNA of her attacker. But for reasons that defied explanation, the kit sat on a shelf, untested, for nearly a year. The Memphis Police Department and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had failed to process it in a timely manner. The dots were finally connected on September 5, 2022, 3 days after Eliza Fletcher was abducted. The DNA from Alicia Franklin's rape kit came back as a match to Cleatha Abston. The realization was sickening. If the rape kit had been tested when it was submitted, Abston would have been identified as a violent predator and likely arrested long before he had the chance to cross paths with Eliza Fletcher on that fateful morning. He should have been in jail. Alicia Franklin later filed a lawsuit against the city of Memphis, her lawyers arguing that the police department's negligence and its failure to investigate her case properly had directly resulted in Eliza Fletcher's murder. They knew who it was, her lawyer stated bluntly. They did nothing, and as a result, Eliza Fletcher winds up murdered when he should have been in jail. If they had done their job, she'd be alive. The revelation added a new layer of tragedy and anger to the case. It was not just the act of a single evil individual. It was a story of systemic failure, of a victim whose plea for justice had been ignored, with fatal consequences for another innocent woman. The murder of Eliza Fletcher was a preventable tragedy, a fact that made the grief even harder to bear. The legal gears began to turn, grinding towards a reckoning for Cleatha Abston. He was now facing two separate, horrific sets of charges, one for the rape and kidnapping of Alicia Franklin in 2021, and another for the kidnapping and murder of Eliza Fletcher in 2022. The cases would proceed on separate tracks, but they were inextricably linked, 2 points on the same dark timeline of a predator's unchecked violence. The first case to go to trial was the one that should have been dealt with long before. In February 2024, Abston appeared in a Memphis courtroom to face the charges related to Alicia Franklin. The trial was swift. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Alicia, with immense courage, testified against the man who had assaulted her. The jury found Abston guilty on all counts: aggravated rape, especially aggravated kidnapping, and unlawful possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. The judge sentenced him to 80 years in prison. It was a measure of justice for Alicia, but it was a justice long delayed, and it came at a terrible cost. With that conviction secured, the focus shifted to the murder of Eliza Fletcher. The trial was scheduled for February 2025. The prosecution, led by Shelby County District Attorney Steve Mulroy, had built what they considered an ironclad case. They had the surveillance footage of the abduction. They had Abston's DNA on the sandals left at the scene. They had records of his cell phone movements and video of him cleaning the vehicle used in the crime. They had the grim testimony of the autopsy report, and they had the damning fact of his prior, nearly identical kidnapping conviction from 2 decades earlier. They were confident in their case and had made their intentions clear. They would seek the death penalty. For months, Abston maintained his plea of not guilty. His defense team prepared for a capital murder trial, a complex and lengthy legal battle. But as the trial date drew closer, the reality of the situation seemed to settle in. The evidence against him was, as one of his own lawyers would later admit, overwhelming. A jury conviction seemed all but certain, and with it, a very rare possibility of a death sentence. Then, in a surprising turn of events, just a few months before the trial was set to begin, Abston's legal team approached the prosecution. They were ready to make a deal. On Monday, October 28, 2024, Cleatha Abston was brought back into the courtroom of Judge Lee Coffey. The atmosphere was heavy with a somber finality. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, Abston stood before the judge, his head bowed. He had agreed to change his plea. In a quiet, barely audible voice, he responded "yeah" to the judge's questions, confirming his decision. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, especially aggravated kidnapping, and tampering with evidence in the abduction and death of Eliza Fletcher. There would be no trial, no lengthy appeals process for the Fletcher family to endure. By pleading guilty, Abston avoided a trial and the potential for a death sentence. The plea agreement carried a mandatory, non-negotiable punishment. Judge Coffey immediately handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence would be added to the 80 years he was already serving for the attack on Alicia Franklin. Cleatha Abston, at 40 years old, would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He would never again be free to harm anyone. He showed no visible emotion as the sentence was read, his head remaining lowered, a silent, inscrutable figure at the center of so much pain. The words captured the essence of Eliza Fletcher's spirit, a spirit of kindness and compassion that stood in stark, tragic contrast to the senseless brutality of her killer. The case was officially closed, but the echoes of the crime continued to reverberate. It left a permanent scar on the heart of Memphis, a city that came together in its grief to honor a woman who was simply doing what she loved. The case stands as a grim reminder of the random, predatory violence that can shatter a peaceful morning, but also as a testament to a community's resilience and a family's enduring love. And it serves as a damning indictment of a system that failed one victim, allowing a monster to walk free and create another. In the end, the story of Eliza Fletcher is one of profound loss, but also one of a light that, even in the darkest of circumstances, could not be completely extinguished.